Let me think.
It's stuck. Baggins is stuck.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until...
Hello and a warm welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. How well do you know the Madeleine McCann case? Well, let's test that right now. You can answer in the comments. 3 simple questions, see if you know the answers. And all of these are yes or no questions. Number 1, did Kate McCann and Madeleine's siblings do a toxicology test? 2, did the McCanns take a polygraph test? 3, did the McCanns participate in a reenactment? To the first question, yes, Kate McCann made herself available for toxicology testing because she was accused of cracking under the pressure, being unstable, I guess, while she was a mother of 3 young children. And perhaps because she was depressed, well, this is the theory, she turned to some or other substance, some other medication that compromised her in some way. According to an article in the Liverpool Echo published in November 2007, quote, one line of inquiry reportedly pursued by Portuguese police was that the qualified GP who grew up in Anfield and Allerton killed Madeleine, now 4, because she was struggling to cope. But her lawyer, Edward Smethurst, said that the results of toxicology tests on Mrs. McCann's hair taken in September show no evidence of drugs in the mum of three's body over the past 8 months. He said there were various stories circulating that Kate might somehow be unstable and might be depressed and whatever, but the test demonstrated that the kind of drug she might be on did not show up. End quote. It seems the police in the McCann case had the same oversimplistic views as those in the JonBenet Ramsey case, that a young child did something and an overstressed mother overreacted and then did something. And this is a sign of not really knowing the true family dynamics, the true complexity of what's going on in the home situation. I have to say, I never believed either of the mothers in these cases deliberately killed their daughters. And I think it's because the truth in this case is so subtle, and true crime is often rotten when it comes to subtlety. How many videos today often have got the word shocking in it? The whole thing with shock value coverage is it's unsubtle, and people seem to like that, which is why we are so bad at things that are so subtle. I find subtlety very interesting, very intriguing, very mysterious. The truth is here, it's like a signal hidden in the noise. And this is why I think after 17 years, so many people still can't figure out what happened, because they're not very good at subtlety. Most people seem to repeat the same obvious but untrue myths over and over again, without thinking critically, without going down a few additional layers and working through the subtleties systematically. You're forced to do that. When you write a book, you're forced to do that, tie the narrative together in a lot of subtle ways that you wouldn't do in a 10-minute video or an hour-long video or even 2 hours long. You've got to link together your narrative in a way that's cohesive, and then you realize start seeing those subtleties. Now, the interesting thing is there were questions of sedation surrounding Madeleine's siblings as well. Do you know whether they also submitted samples for toxicology testing? Do you know? And do you know what the results were? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Thank you to those who have subscribed. By the way, I'll be going live in around about 2 hours after this video is posted, where we'll be talking, just amongst other things, about motive in the Jennifer Dulos murder case. That trial is happening right now in Connecticut. If you're finding this analysis interesting, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. And let's get started. So, to be clear, the notion that Madeleine may have died of an accidental overdose was part of what the investigators officially believed, certainly at one time. And it's not an irrational thought. There was a preponderance of doctors in the group, two of them anesthetists, and it wasn't just one of Madeleine's parents that was a doctor, but both. According to the Evening Standard, quote, the Polizia Giudiziaria have suggested Madeleine died as a result of an accidental drugs overdose, and that the McCanns, both doctors, covered up the death to protect their careers. Now, obviously, this is a very dated article in the Evening Standard, going right back to around about 2007. More specifically, the 20th of October 2007, which was around about 6 weeks, just less than 2 months after they were first officially called arguidos in this case, which happened in early September. And so within 6 weeks, they were very involved. They were doing a lot of their own investigations, I guess, on themselves, their own testing. They'd hired lawyers and, people to a forensic team to address certain questions. And so by the end of that period, at the end of 6 weeks, they said in the media, made quite a big deal about it, that they'd gathered irrefutable proof that the children were never drugged. And so the Standard goes on to write, we understand that samples of hair were given to a forensic team hired by the McCann's lawyers for analysis. The toxicology tests performed on their hair are understood to show no traces of sedatives. The test results are part of a dossier of evidence compiled by the McCann's legal team at law firm Kingsley Napley to show they were not involved in their daughter's disappearance from their Algarve holiday apartment, that's apartment 5A, on 3 May. The article goes on to note, as well as dismissing the drug theory, the lawyers have evidence to disprove allegations that Mr. McCann is not the biological father of Madeleine, a claim which is significant because the McCanns are arguing that DNA evidence in the boot of their hire car comes from the twins rather than the missing child. A source close to the couple said, it would be logical for tests to be carried out on the twins to show they have never been given sedatives. Let's just be clear about the language there. They have never been given sedatives. It would be right to say those tests show no evidence of sedatives in their systems. It backs up Kate and Jerry's claims they have never sedated the children and explains why they are so certain they can prove the allegation is just police smear. End quote. And you would imagine this sort of thing published in the media would probably change quite a few hearts and minds. Wow, so they actually did tests, and the tests show that they're innocent. And Kate McCann actually brings up the same issue of sedation 9 separate times in her book and points out that the toxicology on the twins came back negative. Now, remember, Kate's book was published in 2011, which was essentially 4 years after all of these events. But what is really interesting is the level of detail she goes into when she talks about the sedation. I mean, even she acknowledges in her book that she suspected all 3 of the children may have been sedated based on their demeanor, the fact that the twins were sleeping so soundly despite everything that was going on. So Kate herself made this essentially the same suggestion that law enforcement made. And so isn't there some merit to that question? Well, the obvious unsubtle answer is no. How can there be? There's no evidence. But what happens when we dig a little bit deeper and we look at the question and the analysis in a more subtle way? So first I want to refer to what Kate McCann writes in her book. She says, I felt angry that the children had to go through this further insult. As for me, I looked as if I had alopecia. Though I cursed the abductor and the Polizia Giudiziaria, I had bigger things to worry about. And then, this is the important part, all the hair samples produced negative results. while this didn't totally exclude the possibility that the children had been sedated, that's such an important point that she's making there. She herself is saying, even though there were negative results, this didn't totally exclude the possibility. And she also says why. Because of the time that had elapsed. But then she says what it also meant was nobody else could prove otherwise. In other words, the law and the media could not prove that they'd been sedated. And I do think they took some publications to court for saying in a sort of unambiguous way that they were certainly, definitively, definitely sedated. Kate also writes, it's sadder still that such tests weren't carried out at the time. Now, it is very sad, it is very unfortunate. They were doctors, did they not think about that themselves, if they were being accused of it? Why wait to provide these samples? Why wait months until there's eventually them becoming official arguidos? Why not do so before then? Conversely, by waiting, you now have this lingering uncertainty. Although you can't prove they did sedate in a definitive way, you also can't be absolutely sure they didn't because of this time thing, something that Kate McCann herself says in her book.
Time. The answer is time.
I've said that before, and of course this is a very good example of the answer, the subtle answer lying in this question of time. In hindsight, we wish the toxicology had been done, that the tests had been done immediately, because, as I say, a negative result could then have settled this question once and for all. I do find it interesting that the McCanns seem to have their own legal experts conduct the testing, much as the Ramseys made their own choices for who they wanted to do their polygraphs. And they also paid a team of handwriting experts. And those handwriting experts came to reached a different opinion than other experts. So yes, if there were some chemical traces, perhaps in 4 to 5 months they would have just disappeared from the hair. I suppose if the hair was cut, if the hair was washed, that could alter the outcome. Now what's interesting is Kate emphasizes how having her own hair and her children's hair cut was apparently so traumatic that she cried. That when she heard the scissors in the hair of her children, she was crying. And I must say that within this thing, to me, is very, it's certainly troubling, because you would imagine if the McCanns were innocent, and this was something that could definitely prove their innocence, that you'd be quite happy to do so. To quote from her book, she writes, "I cried as I heard the scissors in their baby blonde hair. And I felt angry that it was, adding insult to injury." And this seems to suggest that she herself would never have cut their hair, and a cursory look through photos from the aftermath doesn't seem to indicate they did. We do know when they returned from Portugal, the hair was actually quite long, but had it been cut before then? In any event, when it comes to the toxicology narrative, in terms of the McCanns, it's hard not to award them a point. The evidence one subtle layer down, right, does seem to benefit them. Now, unfortunately, the same can't be said for a polygraph test. The McCanns were asked to submit to a polygraph, and unlike the Ramseys, they never have. They apparently offered out of their own. They said, we'll take a polygraph when they were made suspects. And this maybe did something to quell the hysteria around, the media hysteria around the fact that they were made suspects in early September. 3 weeks later, 2 to 3 weeks later, they said, we'll take a lie detector test. But by November, they still hadn't, and when this was addressed, McCann spokesman Clarence Mitchell said, of course they are not going to take the test. It's inadmissible in Portugal, and there are doubts about the accuracy. Okay, but then why say you will? So we do know that polygraphs can be quite accurate. We saw this in the Chris Watts case, where he was shown to be very bad at lying, something we knew all along. And certainly in America, polygraph tests are often used to exclude suspects, even if unofficially, in the early stages of investigations. We know that the Ramseys took a really long time to submit to their polygraph. I think they only did theirs in 2000, 3 years and change after the incident. It can be a useful way to counter suspicion, official suspicion, and also in the court of public opinion. So in this area, -1 point for the McCanns. For me, the most interesting aspect is the McCanns and Tupper 7 refusing to participate in a reenactment with law enforcement when they were specifically asked. The Polizia Giudiziaria specifically said, okay, you guys have told us a story, we can make partial sense out of it, let's do this properly and figure it out. And then they say, no, we're not going to, only to do one, and I think they've done several, with their own people, and of course coming out of that with a clean bill of health.
I'll ask you a question about the police inquiry in Portugal and just clear up one or two things. And so, have you been asked to go back and take part in a reconstruction, and under what circumstances would you go back?
There is a dialogue, and that's been reported clearly that there's a date out there and it's under discussion and no final decision has been made. I have to say that the prospect of going back with the world's media trying to watch a reconstruction doesn't appeal us, and how emotional it is for us to consider that. I think also the other issue is how much more information will that get us 1 year on? We have told everything to the police.
We'll do anything if we believe it will help to find Madeleine, but
We'll do anything if it'll help find Madeleine, but when we asked to do a reconstruction, well, it's still being under discussion. Well, ultimately, what did happen? There wasn't a reconstruction with everybody present done formally with the police. It never, ever happened. It was done, I guess, informally and unofficially with other people, with their own people. And so you can say it did take place, but it didn't take place the way that it was supposed to take place. And what is interesting, in a much-viewed clip where Jerry McCann and Kate and Jane Tanner, in one of their own sort of self-made recreations, they can't agree on where they respectively stood when Tanner supposedly saw Tannerman. You even have, I think, the producer saying, these things happen, the important thing is that you hear, etc., etc. Now, if one asks a very simple question, similar to the one asked about the Ramseys, did they cooperate with the police or not? Kind of like a yes or no question. Well, we know in one of the most important areas of all, and bear in mind this was quite complicated. You had two people that were seen by law enforcement as suspects. They had 7 friends basically giving them alibis, but some of those statements were inconsistent. And so they were trying to reconcile, put the clockwork, put that whole symphony of stories into a singular ecosystem and see how it all played out. And then, of course, there was no reenactment done. We also know that when Kate was asked 48 questions during a formal questioning, she refused to answer. So for not doing a reenactment, score -1. If we add the toxicology, polygraphs, and participating in a reenactment, the McCann score a total of 1 out of 3. And that 1 is a little dubious too, because the tests were done quite late. And so the probative value of those tests is not necessarily that good. Curiously, although the toxicology tests were negative, in official police statements, several individuals who were questioned made reference to the use of a medication known as Calpol.
And we thought, when the crime we'd been checking, it would be exceptional for particularly the twins to cry, go back to sleep in between our checks. So obviously kids cry all the time when they're getting bathed, when they're tired, when we're doing that. And we did wonder if it was when they were getting put to bed or around that time. And I think you have to remember.
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.